Bear down. Tonight, this 91-year-old franchise might stop being Chicago's. Not tomorrow, tonight, while politicians in Springfield race against a clock that expires at 11:59 p.m. In a minute, I'll tell you why I think that decision is already made, and why Indiana is sitting back with a smile. Luther Burden III has Ben Johnson talking like a stockbroker at OTAs, and that is a massive signal. But there's one uncomfortable question about Burden that nobody in the Windy City is asking, and the answer is going to flip your whole outlook. And Cole Kmet. ESPN dropped him in a trade to the Kansas City Chiefs. A Bear going to strengthen the dynasty everyone hates. I'll tell you why that offer is a lowball that Ryan Poles should laugh at, and exactly when this trade actually gets done. All of that right now. Let's get into it. Okay. I need everybody to stop everything, the podcast, the scrolling, whatever you're doing, and hear me out for the next few minutes, because what's happening in Illinois today is, without exaggeration, one of the most important days in the modern history of the Chicago Bears. This is not a playoff game. It's not a draft. It's something more permanent than either of those things. It is the decision of where this franchise is going to live for the next 50 years. Let's put everything in full context from the beginning, because a lot of people have been following this superficially and need to understand the real layers of this problem. This is not simply the Bears wanting a new stadium and politicians not wanting to pay for it. It is far more complicated than that, and far more frustrating. The base situation is this. The Bears bought the Arlington Park property in 2021 for $300 million. That was a massive signal. They didn't buy that land to look at it. They bought it because they wanted to build their own stadium, their own entertainment district, their own physical legacy. The vision is a $5 billion domed stadium with mixed-use development surrounding it, hotels, restaurants, entertainment spaces, the kind of ecosystem the Cowboys built in Arlington, Texas, or what the Rams created in Inglewood, a destination, a landmark, something that puts this franchise on the architectural map for generations. But there's a fundamental problem blocking all of that, and it's the one that people consistently misunderstand when they talk about this situation. When the Bears go to a bank to borrow the money needed to finance the bulk of that $5 billion project, the bank needs to know how much they're going to pay in property taxes on that land for the next 40 years. Because if that's not clear, the bank cannot model the risk. And if the bank cannot model the risk, it doesn't lend the money. Full stop. The Bears are not asking the government to build their stadium for them. They are asking for fiscal certainty so they can go out and find private financing on their own. That is what people keep getting wrong every single time this comes up in conversation. Additionally, the Bears are asking for $855 million in public assistance for infrastructure improvements, roads, public transit access, utilities, that kind of thing. That is public money, yes, but it's infrastructure that benefits the entire region, not just the stadium footprint. It's the kind of investment any government makes when it wants to develop a suburban area that is currently an abandoned racetrack generating essentially zero tax revenue for anyone. Now, the Illinois Senate has been trying to pass what they call a mega projects bill since late April. This bill would give the Bears that fiscal certainty in Arlington Heights through a mechanism called a pilot, which stands for payment in lieu of taxes. Essentially, the Bears would pay the government a negotiated fixed amount every year instead of paying variable property taxes. That gives everyone certainty. The Bears know what they owe, the government knows what it receives, the banks can calculate the risk and lend the money. Does that sound reasonable? Because it is. This is exactly the kind of mechanism used in large-scale development projects across the country. But here's what blew everything up politically last week. Cook County Treasurer Maria Pappas released a report saying that under this arrangement, the Bears would receive $1.5 billion in tax breaks over 40 years. And that, politically, was dynamite. Here's my direct take on that number, and I'm going to be blunt. The Pappas report is technically accurate in what it says, but it is profoundly misleading in how it frames the information. When you say someone receives $1.5 billion in tax exemptions, what you're really saying is they'll pay less than they would if the property were fully developed at the standard tax rate. But the property is not fully developed. It's an abandoned racetrack that has been generating essentially zero tax revenue for the region for years. So comparing the pilot payments against a hypothetical full development tax rate and calling the difference an exemption is mathematically dishonest. Nobody was collecting those $1.5 billion before. The land produces almost nothing right now. Any deal that generates regular, predictable tax revenue is better than the status quo. By a lot. Pappas knows that. But releasing a number like $1.5 billion in tax breaks plays better politically than saying we structured a deal that turns a dead asset into a revenue-generating property. And that framing, that political manipulation of a technically true number, gave wavering legislators the cover they needed to vote no. And the nearly round-the-clock negotiations on Friday and Saturday produced no material progress. The megaprojects bill is effectively dead for this session. But here's where this gets truly maddening if you want to analyze it, honestly. Because the real obstacle is not Arlington Heights. It's not the state government. It's not the structure of the deal. The real obstacle is the politics of the city of Chicago and the figure of Mayor Brandon Johnson. Mayor Johnson's position, if you examine it with clear eyes, has no real economic logic behind it. He's saying the Bears must stay at Soldier Field or go to Indiana. He will not sign off on Arlington Heights, which is in Illinois but outside city limits. Why? Because if the Bears build in Arlington Heights, Chicago loses the tax revenue generated by the stadium, loses the game day tourism, loses the economic ecosystem that surrounds an NFL team. And politically, the mayor cannot be the guy who let the team walk to the suburbs. State Senator Bill Cunningham said it directly in public statements this week. From day one, there has always been a Chicago problem with the Bears proposal. That's not a casual comment. That is an Illinois legislator telling his colleagues that the political blockade comes from the city, not from the project itself. The demand the city is making is, I'm going to say this plainly, a shakedown dressed up as negotiation. They want the Bears to help pay off the debt left over from the 2002 Soldier Field renovation. That debt is around $500 million, but the Bears didn't generate that debt. The Bears paid their share of the original renovation agreement. The remaining debt exists because the city tied its payments to taxes on hotels, restaurants, and entertainment venues, and then the pandemic hit in 2020 and wiped out that revenue source for 2 years. That is the consequence of a poorly structured fiscal decision made by Chicago politicians. And now they want the Bears to absorb that loss as a condition for letting them build in a different municipality. That is not a negotiation. That is political extortion dressed up as a stadium conversation. In the final hours before the midnight deadline, a different idea emerged. According to reports from Capital News, Illinois, there is a movement to allow individual communities to establish their own stadium authorities. This would mean Arlington Heights could create its own financing structure for the stadium, independent of Chicago's political blockade. That sounds promising in theory. But there's a massive problem. Under this model, the Bears would be tenants of the stadium, not owners. They would not pay property taxes, but they also would not hold full ownership of the asset. That fundamentally changes the business model of the investment. And here is my strongest critique of this idea. This is not a plan. This is a last-minute patch thrown together literally in the final hours of the legislative session, without anyone having thought deeply about the implications for the local school districts in Arlington Heights that depend on property taxes to fund their schools. If the stadium pays no property taxes, that fiscal burden shifts to local residents. That's going to generate municipal-level opposition that could take months, maybe years, to resolve. The Bears don't have that timeline. They've already said they want to make a final stadium site decision in early summer. Meanwhile, Indiana just waits, quietly, patiently, with approved legislation, with committed funding, with Governor Mike Braun going on Fox News and telling the world he gives it 65 to 35 odds that the Bears come to Hammond. 65 to 35. The governor of a state betting in public, with his name and title attached. That is not a Twitter rumor. That's a governor making a public projection because he knows the numbers and he knows the political situation in Illinois better than most of the people in Springfield do. Now, let me talk about Hammond, honestly, because I think a lot of fans dismiss it too quickly without understanding the actual structure of the deal. In Hammond, the Bears would not be building from scratch the way they're planning in Arlington Heights. They'd be tenants of a stadium built with roughly 60% public financing. The Bears would put in the same $2 billion of their own money they'd contribute in Arlington Heights. But in Hammond, that $2 billion buys them a lease, not ownership of the asset from day one. However, and this is the part nobody talks about, after 40 years, the Bears would own that facility. That changes the long-term calculation significantly. And if the Bears operate and manage the stadium, controlling programming, concerts, corporate events, the difference between owning from day one versus after 40 years becomes less dramatic from an operating revenue standpoint. That said, there's a reality nobody can ignore. Hammond is in Indiana, not Illinois. And the property in question reportedly has environmental remediation challenges because it's an industrial zone. Some reports have described it as a potential landfill site. That is not a minor detail. Building on contaminated land carries remediation costs that can be enormous and unpredictable. That's the kind of risk that banks also want to evaluate before committing. But here's the crucial difference between Indiana and Illinois right now. Indiana has an approved plan and a kept promise. Illinois has a political circus and a legislative session that expired without resolving anything. Here's my honest take on what I think is going to happen. And you might not love what I'm about to say. I believe that if this session ended without a binding, concrete agreement from Illinois, the Bears are going to Indiana. And I think that decision was practically made before Sunday started. I don't say that because I want it to happen. I say it because the Bears have been methodically consistent about one thing for months. They say the choice is between Arlington Heights and Hammond. Not Chicago, not Soldier Field. Arlington Heights or Hammond. And if Arlington Heights cannot guarantee the fiscal certainty the Bears need to secure private financing, Hammond already has it ready. There is no option C that's going to appear magically at the last minute. Senator Cunningham said something that I think is the most honest statement of this entire circus, that legislators want to protect taxpayers and that their constituents can live with the decision. And whether that's what the Bears want is a secondary concern. Translated plainly, that means the political well-being of legislators comes first. The franchise comes second. And that hierarchy of priorities is exactly why Illinois is about to lose the Chicago Bears. Think about it from the perspective of the McCaskey family and Ryan Poles. They've spent 5 years trying to build in Illinois. They bought land for $300 million. They hired architects, consultants, urban planners. They presented proposals to multiple legislative sessions. And every time there appears to be a path forward, Chicago politics blocks it. How many times do you present a reasonable plan to a city that doesn't want to do business with you before you take your investment somewhere that actually wants you? Indiana wants them. And I hate saying this out loud because it genuinely hurts, but sometimes in business, the people who treat you better win. For the fans of the Bears, I want to be clear about one thing. If the Bears move to Hammond, Indiana, they are not moving to Los Angeles. They are not moving to Las Vegas. Hammond is less than 30 minutes from the Loop under normal traffic conditions. Lake Michigan is still Lake Michigan. The Bears are still the Bears. The jersey is still navy and orange. The history of George Halas doesn't change. The Bear Down motto doesn't disappear. 91 years of franchise history don't get erased by a different zip code. But something does change. The emotional relationship of this city with its football team. Chicago is a city of neighborhoods, a ferociously strong local identity, and the Bears have been woven into that identity for decades. Moving them across the state line, even geographically close, creates a psychological distance that's going to take years to process. Fans from the south side, from the north side, from the historic neighborhoods that have had generations of families attending games at Soldier Field, they are going to feel that, and they'll have every right to feel it. And if that happens, the blame does not belong to the Bears organization. The Bears presented a reasonable plan. They bought their own land. They promised to put the majority of the money in from their own pockets. They asked for fiscal certainty to secure their own financing. The blame belongs to a political class in Chicago that could not separate its short-term electoral interests from the long-term well-being of their city. And honestly, that is an institutional tragedy that those politicians are going to carry for a very long time. I needed that break because after everything we just talked through on the stadium, I need to shift to something that has me genuinely fired up about Bears football in 2026. And that something has a name, Luther Burden III. Let's talk about this guy with the seriousness he deserves, because I think most of the public conversation about him is still anchored in his first few weeks as a rookie in 2025, when people started to doubt him. That's exactly the kind of lazy analysis I refuse to do here. Burden arrived in Chicago as one of the most debated receivers in his draft class. His talent after the catch was indisputable. His ability to separate from corners on deep routes was more questionable, and that generated a debate that defined his early public perception. Was he a specialized slot receiver, or was he a complete receiver who could attack all areas of the field? The first half of the 2025 season did not answer that question favorably. Burden had weeks of invisibility. There were games where he simply did not exist in Ben Johnson's game plan. And the narrative started building that Caleb Williams had a stronger connection with Rome Odunze, and that Burden was more of a situational weapon than a primary one. But then came the final 8 weeks of the regular season, and Burden was on a 1,000-yard pace over that stretch. What that means, tactically, is that opposing teams had adjusted their coverages in the second half of the season. They started respecting him more, assigning more consistent defensive resources to him, and he kept producing anyway. That is not a system player. That is a player who understands how to use the scheme to create his own advantages, even when the defense knows he's getting the ball. Now, the PFSN WR impact score of 83.8 that Burden posted in his rookie season was the highest mark among all first-year receivers in the league. Listen closely, not the highest among receivers from the 2025 draft class. The highest among all rookie receivers in the entire league. What does that index measure? It measures receiver impact, adjusted for the quality of coverage he faced, the situations he was deployed in, and the difficulty of the catches he completed. It's a metric that tries to separate genuine receiver impact from system and quarterback, and Burden led that metric among all rookies. Now, I'll be honest about the limitations of that number. A high impact score doesn't automatically tell you whether that player can be the number one receiver in a top-tier system. There are receivers who post high scores as complementary weapons and never make the leap to primary option. The question for Burden in 2026 is not whether he can be good. We already know he's good. The question is whether he can be the receiver Caleb Williams throws to on 3rd and 4 in the fourth quarter of a January game, when the opposing team knows the ball is probably going to him. And here is where the information coming out of OTAs this week becomes genuinely significant. Ben Johnson is not the type of head coach who goes out and praises his players publicly as a performance for the media. Johnson is methodical, precise, and when he talks about a specific player with the language he used this week, there is a concrete reason behind it. He said Burden is moving at a different speed, that the game is slowing down for him, that he's not thinking as much, he's reacting. In the vocabulary of high-level American football, that describes specifically the transition between a receiver who is processing the opposing scheme while running his route and one who already processed everything at the line of scrimmage and can run the route with complete confidence. That transition, in receivers who have Burden's physical ceiling, is when players go from good to dangerous. That's the inflection point. And Johnson is saying Burden is at that point right now, in May, before training camp even starts. Johnson also said something equally important, that Burden has been in the facility all offseason, working with the strength and conditioning staff, expanding his route tree. That last part is critical. If Burden in 2025 was primarily a short and intermediate route runner with explosion after the catch, and in 2026 he can credibly threaten downfield with consistency, defensive coordinators are going to face much harder decisions when covering him. Do you put a physical nickelback on him who can handle contact on short routes? Or do you put a fast cornerback who can cover deep? If you try to do both, you're burning two resources on one receiver, and that opens the field for Odunze, for the tight ends, for whoever else is lined up on the backside. The multiple analysts saying Burden could become the Bears' WR1 over Odunze. I think that's the right question, even if I'm not fully convinced of the answer yet. Odunze has 2 years in Caleb Williams' system. They have a relationship built through his entire integration process, in 2024 and his first full season in 2025. That relationship matters. In high-level football, the quarterback reads coverages and decides in fractions of a second where the ball goes, based on how much he trusts that the receiver is going to be exactly where he's supposed to be on that route. Odunze has a 1-year head start in that level of trust. But there's a counter-argument that's equally valid. Johnson explicitly said making it a priority in 2026 to get the ball in Burden's hands as much as possible. That is not a casual declaration. That is a head coach telling everyone who's listening that the design of the offense in 2026 is going to include Burden as a central threat, not a peripheral one. My honest opinion on this? I think the Bears finished 2026 with both receivers close to 1,000 yards each, with Odunze slightly ahead in total yards, but Burden potentially leading in touchdowns or playing a more defined role in red zone situations. And I think the WR1 versus WR2 conversation becomes irrelevant quickly because Johnson will design a system where both are simultaneous problems the opponent has to solve, and neither one can be solved without exposing the other. That, in terms of offensive philosophy, is where the best attacks in the league live, when the opponent cannot deploy double coverages because you have too many real threats, not fictional ones. And if Burden in 2026 is definitively a real threat that coordinators have to account for in their game planning, the Bears' offense is going to be considerably harder to defend than it was in 2025. And in 2025, it was already good enough to win the NFC North and earn the 2 seed. So the ceiling here is genuinely exciting. The one concern I want to raise that nobody is discussing enough: can Burden stay healthy for 17 games, being the kind of physical receiver his style requires him to be? His game depends on absorbing contact after the catch, on running routes through the intermediate zone where safeties and linebackers hit with intent. He didn't have significant health issues in 2025, but that can change if defensive coordinators start designing hits for him specifically. That's a real factor worth monitoring closely in training camp. If he comes through camp healthy and maintains the level Johnson is describing from OTAs, fam, we're talking about a receiver who can be a top 10 option at the position in the NFC in 2026. And to close things out, let's talk about Cole Kmet, because ESPN ran a trade simulation this week and put him on the market, and 2 proposals came out of it that are worth analyzing honestly. The first, the Cleveland Browns would offer a 2027 4th-round pick. The second, and the more interesting one, the Kansas City Chiefs would offer a 2027 3rd-round pick in exchange for Kmet plus a 2027 5th-rounder. The argument for moving Kmet doesn't require a lot of explanation because the situation is pretty transparent if you look at the numbers and the front office decisions. Chicago selected Colston Loveland at pick 10 in the 2025 draft. That's a first-round tight end with top 10 value. Then in the 2026 draft, the Bears used pick 69 overall on Sam Roush out of Stanford. 2 tight ends selected in 2 consecutive drafts with day 1 and day 2 capital. The signal is obvious. The Bears are building the future of that position around Loveland, and at some point, Kmet becomes redundant. On top of that, Kmet has 0 guaranteed money left on his contract, and his cap hit is scheduled to jump past $15 million in 2027. In a roster that's building toward a contention window with Caleb Williams as the financial centerpiece of everything, every dollar not spent on Kmet in 2027 is a dollar that can go toward extending Williams, toward bringing in an edge rusher, toward shoring up the offensive line depth. Ryan Poles is a general manager who thinks about those trade-offs constantly. That's what makes him a good GM. The Kansas City argument is the most tactically interesting of the two because it starts from a real and urgent need. Travis Kelce is going to end his career after this season, or at the latest, after 2027. He is one of the greatest tight ends in NFL history, but his best years are behind him, and what Eric Bieniemy, back as Chiefs offensive coordinator, is going to need is a tight end who can block in line to support the ground game Kansas City wants to develop, while also being a reliable passing game option, so the offense doesn't become completely dependent on wide receivers. Kmet fits that profile precisely. He is a complete tight end, one of the best inline blockers at his position in the league, and he has solid receiving numbers when used correctly. 73 catches, 719 yards, and 6 touchdowns in 2023 are not numbers from a secondary tight end, and at 27 years old, he has 4 or 5 more years of high-quality football ahead of him. The connection with Bieniemy also matters more than people are giving it credit for. Bieniemy was the Bears' running backs coach in 2025. He knows the team from the inside. He knows what Kmet brings to the field and to the locker room. There's no adjustment period needed, no tape study from scratch. He already has the full picture on what Kmet is as a player and as a person. But here's the problem with that offer that ESPN's Bears reporter Courtney Cronin already identified directly. A 2027 third-round pick plus a fifth is not enough for Chicago right now. And I agree with her completely. The Bears are the 2 seed in the NFC from last year. They are in contention mode, not rebuild mode. Kmet contributes to that goal. You don't move him for a third-round pick when you have the roster capability to make a deep playoff run. Now, my actual position on when and how this trade could happen, because I don't think the answer is never. I think the answer is not yet, with specific conditions. This trade does not happen in June or July. It potentially happens at the October trade deadline if one of 2 things occurs. First, the Bears start 3-4 or worse, and Poles decides this is not the year and begins accumulating picks for the future. Second, somebody calls with a genuine second-round offer or better, and Poles cannot justify turning that down because pick capital will always be the priority for a team still developing its offensive line depth and its edge rush. There's also a third condition that nobody is discussing, and it's actually the most interesting one. If Loveland has a dominant start to the season and Roosh shows he can be a reliable second option, the need for Kmet in the game plan diminishes. And when need diminishes, the logic of selling him at peak value becomes more attractive. Poles is not a sentimental general manager. He is a GM who maximizes asset value at the right moment. And the right moment for a Kmet trade, if it comes, is when his on-field contribution is least critical and his market value is still high enough to return something meaningful. For right now, Kmet remains a bear, but this trade conversation is coming back at the deadline. I'll guarantee you that. That is everything I have for today, fam. And look, I know we're ending on mixed news. The stadium story hurts. The possibility of Illinois losing this franchise because of poorly managed politics is one of the most frustrating things I've had to analyze on this channel. But there are also real reasons to be excited about this team on the field. Luther Burden is about to break out. Ben Johnson's offense has more weapons than it did last year. Caleb Williams still hasn't reached his ceiling, and that should genuinely terrify the rest of the NFC. This franchise has 91 years of history. It has the Bear Down motto. It has Walter Payton. It has Butkus. It has Sayers. It has Ehrlicher. It has the legacy of George Hollis himself. None of that changes with a zip code. But Chicago deserves to have the Chicago Bears in Chicago. And if the politicians of this city couldn't protect that tonight, that is a failure they are going to carry for a very long time. Bear down. Always. Da Bears. If this video gave you something, hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments below, do you think Illinois finds a deal, or are the Bears going to Indiana? I want to read every single answer. See you in the next one.